The explosion came without warning, tearing through the morning silence like the hand of God himself, reaching down to shake the California goldfields. And when the dust finally settled, Russell Reed knew his world had changed forever, even before he realized. He could not hear the screams of the men around him. It was August of 1867, and the mine outside Sonora, California, had been promised as the richest strike in the Mother Lode country. Russell had been 24 years old, strong as an ox, with steady hands and a reputation for being careful with explosives. He had set charges 100 times before, always measuring the black powder with precision, always checking the fuses twice. But someone else had tampered with his work that morning. A newer miner, drunk and careless, had added more powder to speed things along, and when Russell lit what he thought was a properly set charge, the mountain had answered with fury. The blast threw him 15 feet backward into solid rock. His head cracked against granite and the world went white, then red, then silent. Perfectly, absolutely silent. When he opened his eyes, he saw mouths moving, saw men running, saw blood on his clothes, but heard nothing. Not the crackle of settling rock, not the shouts, not even his own voice when he tried to speak. The doctor in Sonora was an older man named Whitmore who had seen every kind of mining accident the gold country could produce. He examined Russell with practiced hands, looking into his ears with instruments, making him try to repeat words he could not hear. Finally, Dr. Whitmore wrote on a piece of paper in clear block letters, "Your hearing is gone. The blast damaged something inside. IT will not come back." Russell stared at those words for a long time. He was a young man, unmarried, with his whole life ahead of him. He had been saving money to buy a piece of land, maybe start a cattle ranch away from the dangerous work of mining. Now he sat in a doctor's office, reading words on paper because he could not hear them spoken, and felt his future crumbling like the walls of an unstable mine shaft. The mining company gave him $60 and told him his services were no longer needed. A deaf man could not work underground where warning shouts meant the difference between life and death. Russell took the money, added it to his savings, and tried to figure out what came next. The other miners were sympathetic but distant. They did not know how to talk to him anymore. They would start to speak, then remember, then either shout uselessly or just walk away. He could see the relief in their eyes when they could avoid him entirely. Sonora was a bustling town in those years, still riding the wealth of the gold strikes even as the easiest pickings had been claimed. The main street featured a dozen saloons, 3 hotels, a newspaper office, shops selling everything from pickaxes to fine china shipped around Cape Horn. Russell walked those streets in his new silence, watching people's lips move, seeing laughter he could not hear, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He took a job at a stable on the edge of town. The owner, a gruff man named Peterson, hired him because horses did not require conversation and Russell's hands were still strong. He mucked stalls, hauled feed, tended to the animals that came through. The horses did not care that he was deaf. They responded to his gentle touch, his calm presence. It was honest work, but it was lonely. 6 months passed this way. Russell learned to read lips a little, enough to catch simple phrases when people faced him directly and spoke slowly, but most people did not have the patience for it. They would start a sentence, realize he was not understanding, and give up with a frustrated gesture. He began to recognize the look people got when they decided he was not worth the effort. It hurt worse than the initial blast had. Then, on a cold February morning in 1868, Sophia Dalton arrived in Sonora on the afternoon stage from Sacramento. Russell was working in the stable yard when the coach rolled past, and he happened to glance up at the exact moment she looked out the window. Their eyes met for just a second, but it was enough for him to notice her. She was young, probably close to his own age, with dark hair pinned up under a modest traveling hat and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked tired from the journey but alert, curious about this rough mining town that would be her new home. He thought nothing more of it. Beautiful women pass through Sonora all the time, usually on their way to somewhere else, occasionally staying as wives of successful miners or merchants. He returned to his work, forking hay into the stalls, and pushed the image of those gray eyes from his mind. 3 days later, she walked into the stable leading a limping mare. Russell was in the back, repairing a broken stall door, and did not hear her enter. He did not know anyone was there until a shadow fell across his work, and he looked up to find her standing a few feet away, holding the reins of a chestnut mare that was favoring her left front leg. The woman's lips were moving, and Russell felt the familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. He stood slowly, setting down his tools, and touched his ear while shaking his head. He had learned this gesture, this quick way of communicating his condition. Most people understood it immediately. Some looked sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some annoyed. Sophia Dalton did none of those things. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those intelligent gray eyes, then nodded once as if confirming something to herself. She pointed to the mare, then to the horse's leg, making a clear gesture of limping. Then she looked at him with raised eyebrows, a question on her face that needed no words. Russell felt something shift in his chest. She had not turned away. She had not given up. She had simply found another way to communicate. He moved to the horse, running his hands gently down the mare's leg, feeling for heat or swelling. There was a stone lodged in the frog of the hoof, a common enough problem. He pulled out his hoof pick and worked it free carefully, then checked to make sure there was no infection starting. The mare would be fine. He turned to tell Sophia this, then remembered she would not hear him. He pantomimed the stone, showed her where it had been, then walked the mare a few steps to demonstrate she was sound again. Sophia's face broke into a smile, genuine and warm, and she reached out to touch his arm in thanks. Then she did something that surprised him. She pulled a small notebook and pencil from her bag and wrote quickly, showing him the page. "Thank you. I am Miss Sophia Dalton. I am the new school teacher." Russell took the pencil from her with slightly shaking hands and wrote below her words, "Russell Reed, I work here. The blast in the mine made me deaf." Sophia read his words and her expression turned serious. She wrote again, "That must be very hard. I am sorry." He wanted to shrug it off, to pretend it did not matter, but something about her direct gaze made him honest. He wrote, "It is lonely." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her thinking. Then she wrote something that would change everything. "I would like to learn how to talk with you. Would you teach me?" Russell stared at those words. No one had ever asked him that. No one had ever suggested that they should be the ones to change, to learn, to bridge the gap his deafness created. He looked up at her, at this young school teacher with her direct gray eyes and her calm presence, and felt hope for the first time in months. He wrote, "Yes." Sophia came back to the stable 2 days later with a book she had ordered from Sacramento. It was a manual on the manual alphabet, a system of hand shapes that represented letters. She had heard about it from another teacher. She wrote to him and thought it might be useful. They could spell words to each other with their hands, and eventually, perhaps develop signs for common words to make communication faster. They started that afternoon, sitting on bales of hay in the stable while Russell was supposed to be working. Peterson did not mind as long as the work got done, and Russell found himself working faster and harder on the days when he knew Sophia would visit, so he would have time to spend with her. Learning the manual alphabet was awkward at first. Their fingers fumbled through the shapes, spelling out simple words letter by letter. Cat, dog, horse. Yes, no. But Sophia was patient and determined, and Russell was motivated by something more than just the desire to communicate. He found himself watching her face as she concentrated, noticing the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking, the way her whole face lit up when they successfully conveyed a complete thought. She told him, through their halting combination of fingerspelling and written notes, that she was from Sacramento, 23 years old, the daughter of a clerk who had died 2 years earlier. Her mother had remarried and moved east, but Sophia had wanted to stay in California. Teaching gave her independence and purpose. She had requested the position in Sonora specifically because she wanted to live in a real frontier town, not a city. She wanted adventure. She wrote with a slightly embarrassed smile, even if it was just the adventure of teaching minors' children their letters. Russell told her his own story. Growing up on a failed farm in Missouri, coming west in 1862 when he was 19, working in mines across the mother-lode country. He had been good at it, he explained. He had understood rock and powder and the way the earth held onto its gold. The accident had taken that from him, but he was learning to build a new life. He did not mention how difficult it had been, how dark some of his days had gotten. She could see that in his eyes, he thought, and he was right. Over the following weeks, they developed their own language. The manual alphabet formed the foundation, but they began to create signs for common words. Sophia approached it like a game, and her creativity surprised him. She would act out a concept until he understood, then they would agree on a sign. Soon they had ways to express horse, work, eat, drink, happy, sad, thank you, and dozens of other useful phrases. Communication was still slower than speaking, but it was real. It was connection, and it was something that belonged just to them. Russell began to notice things about Sophia that had nothing to do with their invented language. The way she always smelled faintly of lavender water. The way she pushed up her sleeves when she was concentrating. The way her laugh, which he could not hear, seemed to make her whole body move with joy. He found himself thinking about her when he should have been thinking about work, imagining what she was doing, whether she was thinking about him. He did not let himself hope for too much. She was an educated schoolteacher, and he was a deaf, stable hand. But she kept coming back, week after week, bringing new ideas for signs, telling him stories about her students, asking him questions about horses and mining and his life before the accident. Spring came to Sonora with wildflowers covering the hills, and the creeks running high with snowmelt from the Sierras. Sophia suggested they practice their communication outside the stable, and they began taking walks on Sunday afternoons when she was free from teaching and he was done with work. They climbed the trails above town, sat by rushing streams, and talked with their hands in the golden California sunlight. It was on one of those walks, in late April, that Russell realized he was in love with her. They had stopped to rest on a flat rock overlooking the town, and Sophia was telling him an animated story about one of her students who had brought a frog to school. Her hands flew through the signs and fingerspelling, her face expressive and bright, and Russell felt his heart contract with the intensity of what he felt. This woman had seen him at his lowest, had witnessed his disability without flinching, and had decided he was worth the effort of learning an entirely new way to communicate. She had given him back his voice in a way he never expected, and in the process, she had become the most important person in his world. He must have been staring because Sophia stopped mid-story and signed the question. What? Russell hesitated. They had learned to communicate facts and stories and daily information, but they had not yet developed the vocabulary for emotions this complex. He did not have the signs for what he wanted to say. So he pulled out the small notebook he now carried everywhere and wrote carefully, "You are the best thing that has happened to me since the accident. I think about you all the time. I do not know if I should tell you this, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel it." Sophia read the words slowly, her cheeks flushing pink. Russell's heart hammered in his chest. He had ruined everything. He had pushed too far, assumed too much. She would stop coming to see him now, and he would be alone again in his silent world. But Sophia looked up from the notebook with tears in her eyes, and she was smiling. She took the pencil from him and wrote below his words, "I feel the same way. I was afraid you only saw me as a friend, as someone helping you learn to communicate. I did not know if you could want someone like me." Russell read those words 3 times to make sure he understood. Then he took the notebook back and wrote, "Someone like you, you are everything. You are smart and kind and patient. You learned to speak where I could see. How could I not love you?" The word hung there between them on the page. Love. He had written it before he could second-guess himself, and now it was real and permanent in ink. Sophia's tears spilled over, and she laughed silently, covering her mouth with one hand. Then she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly, and wrote with her other hand, "I love you too, Russell Reid." They sat there on the rock overlooking Sonora, holding hands and crying and laughing, and Russell felt the silence that had imprisoned him for so long transform into something different. It was still there, the deafness was still permanent, but it was no longer a wall separating him from the world. Sophia had climbed over that wall to reach him, and together they had built a bridge. Courting in their unusual circumstances required creativity. They could not attend the town dances because Russell could not hear the music and could not follow conversations in crowded rooms. They could not go to theatrical performances or lectures, but they found their own entertainment. They took long rides into the hills, with Sophia riding her chestnut mare and Russell on a steady bay gelding borrowed from the stable. They had picnics by mountain streams. They visited the small library in Sonora, sitting together and reading, occasionally passing notes about the books. They taught each other constantly, Sophia learning about horses and the mountains, Russell learning about literature and history from her extensive reading. The people of Sonora gradually became accustomed to seeing them together. At first, there was some gossip. The pretty schoolteacher and the deaf stable hand made an unusual couple, and not everyone approved. Some thought Sophia was wasting herself, that she could do better than a man who could not even hear his own name spoken. Others thought Russell was taking advantage of a kind woman's sympathy. But Sophia did not care about gossip, and she made that clear. When Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and a member of the school board, suggested that Sophia should be more careful about her reputation, Sophia looked her in the eye and said clearly, "Mr. Reid is the finest man I have ever known, and I am proud to be seen with him. If the school board has concerns about my teaching, I will be happy to discuss my performance, but my personal life is my own affair." Mrs. Henderson had no response to that, and word got around town quickly. Sophia Dalton was not to be trifled with. Russell heard about the exchange through a written note from Peterson, who had been in the shop when it happened, and he felt a fierce pride in the woman he loved. Summer arrived with scorching heat that baked the goldfields. Russell worked shirtless in the stable, hauling water for the horses, and Sophia finished her school term and suddenly had long days of freedom. She spent many of those days at the stable, helping Russell with the work, learning to curry horses and clean tack. Peterson paid her a little for the help, though she insisted it was not necessary. She was not working for money, she explained to Russell in their private sign language. She was working to be near him. On a breathless evening in July, with the sun setting behind the western hills and painting the sky orange and purple, Russell asked Sophia to marry him. They were alone in the stable, finishing the evening feeding, when he pulled her aside to the tack room and handed her a folded paper. She opened it, and inside was a simple drawing he had made of two hands clasped together, and below it, "Sophia Dalton, will you marry me and let me spend my life learning new ways to tell you I love you?" Sophia's hands shook as she held the paper. She looked up at Russell, at his sunburned face and hopeful eyes, and signed the word they had created together for yes, emphatic and clear. Then she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, and Russell felt her laughter against his chest, felt the way she held him like she would never let go. They married in September of 1868 in a simple ceremony at the small church in Sonora. The minister was initially uncertain about marrying a deaf man, worried about whether the vows would be binding if Russell could not hear them spoken. But Sophia had prepared for this. She had written out the complete ceremony, and Russell read each vow carefully before signing his agreement in front of witnesses. He spoke the words aloud too, though he could not hear his own voice and had to trust that he was saying them correctly. Sophia later told him he had done perfectly, and that his voice had been steady and clear when he promised to love her for the rest of his life. Peterson stood as Russell's witness, and one of the other teachers from the school stood for Sophia. The church was not full, but the people who came were the ones who mattered. Dr. Whitmore attended, the man who had first told Russell his hearing was gone, and Russell saw approval in his eyes. A few of the miners Russell had worked with before the accident came, good men who had not forgotten him. And a surprising number of parents of Sophia's students attended, wanting to show support for the teacher who had taught their children with such dedication. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the hotel. Sophia had arranged everything, knowing that Russell would struggle in a crowded social situation. She stayed at his side constantly, interpreting conversations for him when necessary, making sure he was included. She had taught some of their closest friends a few basic signs, so they could offer congratulations directly. It was not perfect, but it was real, and Russell felt embraced by community in a way he had not since before the accident. They rented a small house on the outskirts of Sonora, a 2-room cabin with a front porch and a view of the hills. It was not much, but it was theirs. Russell continued working at the stable, and Sophia returned to teaching when the fall term began. They fell into the rhythms of married life, learning each other's habits and preferences, building a home together. The intimacy of marriage deepened their communication in unexpected ways. They developed signs for private things, tender things, creating a language that was entirely their own. Sophia learned to wake Russell by touching his shoulder gently, learned that he slept more soundly than hearing people because no noise could disturb him. Russell learned to read Sophia's moods in the set of her shoulders and the rhythm of her movements, learned when she needed conversation and when she needed quiet presence. They talked about the future, about their dreams. Russell wanted to save enough money to buy land, to start a small ranch where he could work with horses and maybe cattle. Sophia wanted children someday, wanted to fill their home with life and love. They both wanted to stay in Sonora, in this rough gold country that had brought them together. In the spring of 1869, Sophia discovered she was pregnant. She told Russell by taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, then signing the words for baby and future and love. Russell felt tears on his cheeks, felt a joy so intense it was almost frightening. A child. His child. Their child. He had been so focused on the things the accident had taken from him that he had not let himself imagine what might still be possible. But here it was, this impossible gift, this future he had not dared to hope for. The pregnancy was difficult at times. Sonora's summer heat was oppressive, and Sophia struggled with nausea in the early months. But she continued teaching as long as she could, not wanting to leave her students until absolutely necessary. Russell worried about her constantly, bringing her cool water, making sure she rested, trying to take on more of the household chores. Sophia accepted his care with grace, though she also reminded him that she was strong, that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, that she would be fine. In November, when the baby's arrival was imminent, Sophia finally stopped teaching. The school board had already hired a temporary replacement, a young man fresh from Sacramento who would hold the position until Sophia was ready to return. She and Russell spent quiet days at home, preparing the small second room as a nursery, washing tiny clothes Sophia had sewn, discussing names. The baby came on a cold December night. Russell had been dreading this moment, worried about how his deafness would affect the situation. What if something went wrong and Sophia needed to call for help? What if he could not hear the doctor's instructions? But Sophia had planned for everything. She had arranged for Mrs. Chen, an experienced midwife who had delivered half the babies in Sonora, to attend the birth. Mrs. Chen did not speak much English, which actually helped. She was accustomed to communicating with gestures and demonstrations, and she worked with Russell to make sure he understood what was needed. The labor was long and hard. Russell stayed by Sophia's side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, feeling completely helpless. He could not hear her cries of pain, but he could see them in her face, in the way her body tensed and struggled. He had never felt his deafness as a curse quite like this, being unable to hear his wife suffering, unable to offer her the comfort of hearing his voice reassuring her. But Sophia never let go of his hand. Even in the worst moments, she held on to him, drew strength from his presence. And when Mrs. Chen finally held up a squalling infant, red-faced and furious at being born, Sophia's exhausted smile was the most beautiful thing Russell had ever seen. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby quickly and placed him in Sophia's arms. A boy. They had a son. Sophia looked down at the tiny face, then up at Russell with tears streaming down her cheeks. She signed to him with one hand, still cradling the baby with the other. Our son. Perfect. Healthy. Beautiful. Russell touched the baby's impossibly small hand, felt tiny fingers curl around his own finger, and felt his world expand to include this new life. He had lost so much in the mine explosion, had spent months believing his life was effectively over. But now he had a wife who loved him and a son who would grow up learning two languages, the language of spoken words and the language of hands, equally fluent in both worlds. They named him Thomas Dalton Reid, Thomas for Russell's father who had died when Russell was young, and keeping Sophia's maiden name as a middle name. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, though of course Russell could not hear his cries. Sophia developed a system of hanging a small bell near the baby's cradle that she could ring to get Russell's attention when the baby needed something, and she could not leave what she was doing. It worked well enough, though Russell often simply stayed near the baby, watching him sleep, marveling at this small miracle. Sophia healed from the birth and slowly regained her strength. She decided not to return to teaching immediately. She wanted time with Thomas, wanted to be home during his first years. The temporary teacher was doing well, and the school board agreed to extend his contract. Sophia had some savings, and Russell's wages from the stable, while modest, were enough to support them if they were careful. Life settled into new patterns. Russell worked during the day, came home to his small family in the evenings. Sophia kept the house, cared for Thomas, and began taking in some sewing work to earn a bit of extra money. They were not wealthy, but they were happy in a deep, sustaining way that had nothing to do with material comfort. Thomas grew quickly, as babies do. By his first birthday, he was walking unsteadily and beginning to make sounds that might someday be words. Sophia spoke to him constantly, singing songs Russell could not hear, reading stories aloud. But she also signed to him, and Russell did the same. Thomas would learn both, would grow up able to communicate with his father as easily as with anyone else. Russell watched his son and wife together and sometimes had to turn away from the intensity of what he felt. Gratitude, love, a sense of wholeness he had thought was lost forever. The explosion had damaged his hearing for good, had taken something that could never be restored. But it had also, in some strange way, led him to Sophia. If he had not been working in that stable, if she had not needed help with her mare, if she had not been the kind of person who saw his deafness as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to avoid him, none of this would exist. In the summer of 1870, Russell's careful saving finally paid off. A rancher 30 miles north of Sonora was selling his property, a modest spread with grazing land for cattle and several good outbuildings. The price was reasonable because the rancher was old and had no heirs and just wanted to see the place go to someone who would work it. Russell and Sophia rode up to see it, bringing Thomas in a sling against Sophia's chest. The land was beautiful, rolling hills with good grass, a creek running through the southern portion, and a solid house that was larger than their cabin in Sonora. There was a barn that needed some repairs and corrals that were still sound. Russell could see the potential immediately. He could raise horses here, breed and train them, maybe run some cattle. It would be hard work, but it would be his own. Sophia loved it too. She walked through the house, pointing out where furniture would go, where Thomas would play, where they might add on if they had more children someday. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, so it would be isolated, but Sonora was not so far that they would be cut off from town when they needed supplies or wanted to see friends. They bought the ranch with most of their savings, a leap of faith that left them with almost nothing in reserve but the promise of a future built by their own hands. Peterson was sorry to lose Russell from the stable, but understood his desire for independence. He gave Russell a good horse as a parting gift and made him promise to visit when they came to town. Moving to the ranch was an adventure. They loaded their few possessions into a wagon and made the journey over rough roads, with Thomas alternating between sleeping and fussing. The house needed cleaning and some repairs, but it was structurally sound. They spent the first week scrubbing and mending, making the place theirs. Russell threw himself into the work of ranching. He repaired fences, cleared brush, assessed the property thoroughly. He used part of his remaining money to buy 3 young horses he could train and sell, and he bought 4 bred heifers that would calve in the spring and start his cattle herd. The work was hard and the days were long, but it was satisfying in a way mining had never been. This was building something, not just taking from the earth. Sophia made the house a home. She planted a vegetable garden near the kitchen, hung curtains she had sewn herself, arranged their few pieces of furniture for maximum comfort. She continued to care for Thomas and also began helping with the ranch work when she could, proving herself capable with horses and unafraid of hard labor. Their isolation meant they saw fewer people, but they had each other, and that was enough. They developed their communication even further, refining their sign language, adding new vocabulary as they needed it. Thomas was learning to sign before he could speak clearly. his small hands forming approximations of the signs he saw his parents use. Russell's heart swelled every time his son signed to him, these small gestures of connection that bridged the silence. The first year on the ranch was challenging. There were unexpected expenses, a dry spell that hurt the grass, a difficult winter when they had to use precious feed to keep the livestock healthy. But they endured. Russell sold 2 of the trained horses for good prices, which helped replenish their depleted savings. The heifers calved successfully in the spring, giving them 4 strong calves and doubling their cattle herd. Things were tight, but they were moving in the right direction. In the fall of 1871, Sophia told Russell she was pregnant again. This time the news was less surprising but no less joyful. Thomas was nearly 2 years old, walking and getting into everything, chattering in a mix of spoken words and signs. A sibling would be good for him, and they had always wanted more than one child. This pregnancy was easier than the first. Sophia was stronger, more confident, and she had done this before. Mrs. Chen agreed to come out to the ranch when the time came, for an extra fee to compensate for the travel. Russell prepared carefully, making sure they had everything they would need, determined that this birth would go smoothly. Their daughter was born in April of 1872. A tiny thing with dark hair like her mother, and a surprisingly loud cry that Russell could not hear, but could see in the baby's red face and open mouth. Sophia was exhausted but triumphant, holding their daughter and their son, who had been allowed in to meet his sister. Russell stood looking at his family, at the wife who had learned to speak where he could see, at the children who were learning both languages from birth, and felt a contentment so profound. It was almost overwhelming. They named her Mary, after Sophia's mother. She was a good baby, easier than Thomas had been, and she grew quickly. Thomas was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help care for her, bringing her toys, signing to her even though she was too young to understand. The ranch continued to grow. Russell's reputation as a horse trainer spread, despite his deafness, because horses did not care if their trainer could hear. They cared about touch and consistency and understanding, and Russell had all of that in abundance. People began bringing him difficult horses, young horses that needed breaking, older horses with bad habits. He worked with them patiently, and his success rate was high. The income from horse training became more significant than the cattle, though they kept the small herd for their own beef and to sell a few calves each year. Sophia took on more of the ranch management, keeping the books, arranging sales, corresponding with buyers. Her education served them well. She was organized and detail-oriented, and she had a head for figures that Russell lacked. They made a good team, each contributing their strengths, covering for each other's weaknesses. Years passed in the rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew tall and strong, helping his father with the horses from a young age. Mary was bright and quick, learning to read before she turned 5, absorbing everything her mother could teach her. Both children were completely bilingual, moving between spoken English and signed communication without thought, depending on whether they were talking to their father or to others. Russell had been worried about how his deafness would affect his ability to be a good father, but those fears proved unfounded. His children never saw his deafness as a limitation. It was simply part of who their father was, like his brown hair or his preference for black coffee. They learned early to face him when they wanted his attention, to sign when speaking would not work, to tap him on the shoulder to get his attention. It was natural to them, and because it was natural to them, Russell's deafness became less of a barrier than it had ever been. In 1876, when Thomas was 7 and Mary was 4, Sophia gave birth to their third child, another boy they named James. The ranch was prosperous enough now that the addition to their family did not cause financial strain. They had expanded the house, adding 2 more rooms so the children could have their own spaces. They had hired a hand to help with the heavy work, a young man named Miguel who was respectful of Russell's deafness and learned basic signs to communicate with his employer. The children filled the house with noise Russell could not hear but could feel in the vibrations of their running feet, could see in their animated faces, could understand through their flying hands as they signed their adventures and arguments and affections. Sophia was the center of the household, managing everything with calm efficiency, still as beautiful to Russell as she had been the day he first saw her looking out the stage coach window. On a summer evening in 1877, Russell and Sophia sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the western hills. The children were in bed, the ranch was quiet, and they had a rare moment of peace together. Sophia took Russell's hand and signed to him, "Are you happy?" Russell looked at her, at the gray in her dark hair that had not been there when they met, at the laugh lines around her eyes, at the calluses on her hands from years of hard work. He thought about the explosion that had taken his hearing, about the dark months when he had felt broken and useless, about the moment she had walked into that stable and changed everything. He thought about their children, their home, the life they had built together against all odds. He signed back to her, "I am more than happy. I am blessed. You learned to speak where I could see, and you gave me back my life." Sophia smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat that way as darkness fell, comfortable in their silence, which had long ago stopped being empty and had become instead a shared space full of meaning. Thomas grew into a fine young man, skilled with horses like his father, responsible and hardworking. When he turned 18 in 1881, Russell deeded him a portion of the ranch land so he could start building his own future. Mary proved to have her mother's gift for teaching, and when she was old enough, she began helping educate the children of the few neighboring ranches, riding from place to place with her books and her patient manner. James was still young, but he showed signs of being the scholar of the family, always reading, always asking questions that Sophia delighted in answering. Russell was 41 years old now, his body bearing the marks of hard work and that long-ago explosion. His hands were scarred, his back sometimes ached, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. But he was healthy and strong, and every day he woke up next to the woman he loved, in the house they had built together, on land that belonged to them. The ranch had become well known in the region. Russell Raid, the deaf horse trainer, was something of a legend. Stories circulated about his almost supernatural understanding of horses, his patience, his skill. People came from as far as Sacramento to have him work with their animals. He commanded good prices for his services now, and the family was comfortable, even prosperous by the standards of their area. But success and money had never been the point. The point was the life they had made, the family they had raised, the love that had sustained them through difficult years, and would continue to sustain them through whatever came next. In 1883, on a spring morning much like the one when they had first met, Russell and Sophia took a rare day away from ranch duties to ride up into the hills, just the two of them. It was something they tried to do a few times a year, a chance to be alone together, to remember who they had been before they became parents and ranchers and pillars of their small community. They rode to a high meadow filled with wildflowers and dismounted to let the horses graze while they sat in the grass. Sophia unpacked the lunch she had brought, bread and cheese and dried apples, and they ate contentedly. Then she pulled out a small notebook, one of dozens they had filled over the years with their written conversations, and wrote, "Do you ever regret it? The accident, everything that happened, the life you might have had if you had not gone deaf." Russell read her question and understood why she was asking. They had been married 15 years, had built a good life, but she still sometimes worried that he mourned what he had lost. He took the pencil and wrote carefully, "I cannot say I am glad the explosion happened. It was terrible and painful, and I lost something that can never be replaced. But I am not sorry for where it led me. If I had not been working in that stable, you would have met a different man when your horse went lame. Someone who could hear. Maybe you would have married him instead. I would have missed out on you, on our children, on this life. So no, I do not regret the path I walked. It was hard, but it led me home." Sophia read his words with tears in her eyes. She took the pencil back and wrote, "You were always home. From the first moment, I saw you trying to fix that stall door and not knowing I was there. I knew somehow that you were important. I just did not know how important yet." They sat together in the flower-filled meadow, holding hands like they had on that first day when Russell confessed his feelings, and watched the clouds move across the California sky. The silence between them was full of everything they had lived through together, every struggle and triumph, every moment of connection. As the years continued to pass, the ranch thrived and the family grew in unexpected ways. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter in 1885, a practical young woman named Catherine, who learned sign language so she could communicate with her father-in-law. They built a house on Thomas's portion of the property and started their own family. Russell and Sophia became grandparents, a role that delighted them both. Their first grandson, named Russell after his grandfather, was born in 1886, and Sophia immediately began teaching the baby signs, determined that he would grow up able to talk to his grandfather. Mary continued her teaching work and showed no signs of wanting to marry, much to the confusion of some neighbors. She was content with her books and her students, and Sophia defended her daughter's choices fiercely. Not every woman needed a husband to have a meaningful life, she declared, and if Mary wanted to remain independent, that was her right. Russell agreed completely. His daughter was happy and fulfilled, and that was all that mattered. James went to school in Sacramento when he turned 16, boarding with a family friend and attending a proper academy. He had ambitions beyond ranching, dreams of becoming a lawyer or perhaps a journalist. Russell and Sophia supported these dreams, even though it meant James was away from home most of the year. They had never wanted to limit their children, had always encouraged them to find their own paths. In 1890, Russell turned 47 years old. It had been 23 years since the explosion that changed his life. He thought about that young man sometimes, the one who had set the charge that morning not knowing it would rob him of his hearing. That young man had thought his life was over when he could no longer work in the mines, when communication became a struggle, when the world went silent. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he could not see what might still be possible, but Sophia had seen. She had looked at a deaf, stable hand and seen not disability but possibility. She had learned to speak where he could see, had created a bridge across his silence, and had invited him to meet her there. Everything that came after, the marriage and the children and the ranch and the life they had built, all of it flowed from that single decision to see him as fully human, fully capable of love and connection and contribution. Russell tried to express this to her one evening, signing and writing in their notebook, trying to put into words what her love had meant. Sophia listened, watched his hands, read his words, and then she signed back simply, "You gave me just as much. You showed me what real strength looks like. You taught me that barriers are meant to be overcome. You loved me completely, and you gave me a family and a home and a purpose. We saved each other, Russell. That is what love does." They sat together on their porch, just as they had done countless times over the years, and watched the sun set behind the hills. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family. Thomas and Catherine had come for dinner with their 3 children, and the house was full of laughter and conversation, and the chaos of grandchildren. Mary was reading to the youngest ones, using signs as she read so that Russell could follow the story if he wanted to watch. James was home from Sacramento for a visit, telling stories about his studies, his future bright and full of possibility. Russell could not hear any of it, the voices or the laughter or the children's questions. But he could see it all, could feel the vibrations of footsteps on the wooden floors, could read the joy in every face. His family had learned to speak where he could see, every one of them, and in doing so they had created a world where his deafness mattered less and less. As full darkness fell and stars began to appear in the California sky, Sophia rested her head on Russell's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, pulling her close. They had grown old together, these 2 people who had found each other in a rough mining town when both were young and uncertain. They had built something lasting, something real, something that would continue in their children and grandchildren long after they were gone. The explosion had damaged Russell's hearing for good, a permanent injury that could never be healed. But Sophia had learned to speak where he could see, and in that simple, profound act of love, she had given him back the world. They had created their own language, their own way of being together, and it was beautiful. Russell looked up at the stars, at the vast California sky stretching overhead, and felt a peace that went deeper than hearing or silence, deeper than words or signs. He had lost something in that mine, but he had found something far more valuable. He had found love and family and purpose. He had found home. And in the warm summer darkness, with his wife beside him and his family safe inside the house they had built together, Russell Reed knew that he was, in every way that mattered, a fortunate man. The silence that had once seemed like a prison had become a shared space, a different way of being in the world, made rich and full by the woman who had chosen to meet him there. The dynamite blast had damaged his hearing for good, but it had led him to the woman who learned to speak where he could see, and that had made all the difference.